From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now, or learn the stuff they don't want you to know.
I'm on a ghost train this week, everybody, and you're on the ride with me. Guess what? Let's do this. We got a message, a really great message from Dennis. Dennis, you wrote to us about our Rock of Gibraltar episode, and it's in reference to the story we talked about on a Strange News episode a little while back, where we discussed the hidden spy room, essentially, large enclosure where 6 men were supposed to stay in the case of the Rock of Gibraltar being taken over by the Axis Nazi forces. And you wrote to us with a personal experience, so I'm going to read through it. It's pretty long. Bear with me. It's a great story, and there is a ghostly tale amidst the words here. Here we go. Dennis, you said, "Hello, guys. I listened to your recent story about Gibraltar and its caves and tunnels, and it reminded me of my trip there. At the time, I was in the Navy on a submarine, and it was our last Liberty port at the end of a deployment to the Mediterranean and Persian Gulf. There are tunnels in the rock dating back hundreds of years, but as you said, the World War II tunnels were probably the largest. There are civilian tunnel tours, but as we were the military unit, we got a special tour with some of the local military units." That's very cool, Dennis. He says, "The tunnels seem to be much longer than the Rock of Gibraltar itself, and there were pipes and cables strung along one... Beep! The tunnels seem to be much longer than the Rock of Gibraltar itself, and there were pipes and cables running along one side. As we walked, you could hear the pipes settling with temperature changes. It would be just creaks and pops that started at one point, and it would make their way all the way down the length of the pipes, so you could hear the sounds coming towards you, passing you, and retreating away. Nothing really weird about it. I would say that would creep me out already a little bit, especially being in that enclosed tunnel the way it is. Dennis, by the way, sent us a great picture of a tunnel that looks like this, that has pipes running down one side. It's very long, it's darkened, there are a couple of lights in there, and you really get a sense of what that must feel like. But it didn't freak Dennis out at all. He was totally fine with it. Let's continue. He says, "About 20 guys from my boat went on the tour, and it was some typical stuff pointing out storage tunnels or command radio offices. About halfway through the tour, there was a branch-off tunnel that went perpendicular to the main tunnel. The tour guide told us that we could take a break while he made a phone call. But if we went up the branched-off tunnel on the right, there would be a ladder and we could climb and look into a natural cave discovered while digging in World War II. Sounds awesome. Maybe 5 or 6 guys went and looked at the cave while the rest took a rest. After I looked at the cave, I went a little further up the tunnel and looked around. After the prescribed time passed, we all gathered back at the main tunnel. Now, the tour guide asked if anyone went further up the tunnel from the ladder, and, a couple of us raised our hands, said, yeah. The guide asked if we saw a bunch of flowers on the wall, and he said they'd likely be dried by now. Dennis hadn't noticed them, but this is the story that the tour guide told them. He said about 3 months ago, they'd had a ceremony for an older woman to come and place those flowers on the wall. This woman was born in England during the war, and her father had shipped out before she was born, so she never saw her father because he was sent to Gibraltar and he was working digging the tunnels there into the rock when he died during a cave-in. So there was a young woman whose father left to go dig tunnels in Gibraltar. He died there. She never got to meet her father. Now, apparently, there were a few cave-ins that did occur, and they didn't know exactly where this person died, where the rock collapsed on him. So they chose this specific spot to memorialize this death. That's where they put the flowers, right? And that way she could come and remember, or at least think about the father that she never met. Then she apparently went back to England after this ceremony. Now, according to Dennis's email, the tour guide says he was finishing up another similar tour a few weeks after this woman had gone home. he locked up one end of the tunnel and he was walking back to the beginning of the tunnel where the tour begins, right? He's all alone in these massive tunnels. He's walking with the piping on his right side, and he said he heard noises the way you do, the way Dennis has described, he heard coming up from behind him, right? Just coming up. It's reaching closer and closer and closer. But as that sound reached where he was, and instead of passing him down the tunnel, the sounds just stopped right behind him. And he felt someone or something pull on his right sleeve. You can imagine how unnerving that would be, right? So he stopped, looked behind him. He didn't see anything. And he just kind of turned around and kept walking. Further down, he had the same thing happen. Noises coming up from behind him, stopping, and then another sleeve tug. At this point, he's extremely weirded out and afraid, so he hurried to the gate, locked it, and he went to the officers' club, essentially a restaurant and lounge, like a bar, right, where you can go after work. So his wife was tending to the bar, so he goes, he gets a beer, he sits down, his kids are there. This must have been a day tour. The one that Dennis went on was a night tour, but this one must have been a day tour, he says. And, they're hanging out, playing or something. He's feeling kind of frazzled. He's telling the story of what just occurred, right? Then he notices a woman over at the pool, and the tour guide doesn't recognize this person. A lot of times these clubs have officers visiting from out of town or from, who are stationed somewhere else. Maybe their families are in town. There's a lot of times strangers in an officers club like that. But, he's noticing that she's staring at him. When she notices him staring back, she walks over and begins talking to our tour guide here. She excuses her intrusion when she shows up. She says, I don't normally do this kind of thing. But she's sensitive to things, and there was a man standing with her that could tell she could see him when others couldn't. She said that the man is really sorry he missed his daughter, and is there any way they could bring her back so he could see her? He says he was frozen there in shock. They did what they could do to raise more money to get her back, this woman who, lost her father before she ever met him and then laid the flowers. But as of the time that at least Dennis was there visiting at the Rock of Gibraltar, they hadn't raised enough money. And Dennis finishes it after that story with Gibraltar was probably the best port he got to visit during his active duty, and he's really glad he had a ghost story to share about it. So, just really interesting. I wanted to read that because that kind of thing, that kind of interaction where someone appears to be able to see someone or talk with or interact with someone who has already passed has always fascinated me. I think fascinates everybody here, you too probably. The concept in this of it occurring in this place where you'd imagine it could be haunted, right? Just with the amount of past that place has seen, sure. The number of people who've gone through it, where humans have been lost in collapses, where there's been a lot of digging and blasting of rocks and stone. I imagine that would be the kind of place, if it was possible, if the physics worked out, that a resonance could occur, where a life, a living person, whatever it is that makes us human and intelligent, the thing that we don't currently fully understand right now, whatever that is, I can imagine it staying in that stone somehow.
Sure. Or like my earlier point from the Dream series, maybe this person's quantum, maybe their microtubules are very sensitive to events happening in a symmetry of time. We know this idea about some sort of intangible impression being left of physical memory somehow imprinted. It's usually portrayed as something that happens at times of great unrest. I mean, sorry, before I go off, I'm a dog with a ball in this stuff. Dennis, thank you for what a journey. We got a frame story, we got an epilogue, we've got the whole nine. A couple of quick things before we dive in. Just for anybody who is wondering, a Liberty port is like shore leave. You don't have to stay on the boat. You can get out and have fun. You know what I mean? I think, didn't he say Liberty port there, Matt?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. So that was his last chance to party. And one thing about this this story you're telling, I do agree with you, Matt. There is this commonality of experience, right? Maybe not super frequent. Not everybody listening knows someone who claims to see these figures of people who have passed or these apparitions, but it's an idea that is familiar to all of us in the world. And it gets really interesting when we go into cultures where death is sort of acknowledged as like, death is just kind of like moving to a different part of a city called the universe, right? In those cultures, it is much less stigmatized to say, I have seen this ghost. And Gibraltar itself, to your earlier point about ghost tours, I was surprised by how riddled Gibraltar is with purported ghost and ghostly activities. It's awash in them, and I think it makes sense. Whether or not you believe in ghosts, it makes sense that those stories would exist because this thing has been a geopolitical flashpoint, the subject of so much blood and treasure over the centuries. It would almost be abnormal for those, it would almost be unusual for those tunnels not to have a ghost story. I'm being very careful, by the way, to say ghost story necessarily for ghosts. But I wonder, Dennis, you say you've got a great ghost story from the tour guide, but maybe I missed this, Matt. I didn't see anything in our letter from Dennis where you, Dennis, say whether or not you believe the story.
There you go. There's the rub.
Well, no, we didn't. We did get a very vivid picture of what the tour guide experienced that was also experienced by Dennis with the pipes and the sounds moving past him. So he's maybe giving us a way to explain what's occurring, right?
Uh-huh.
But the thing that it's harder to explain is how somebody there knew about this whole situation with the woman who placed the flowers in this part where people generally don't tour. Weird.
Yeah, and there are any number of ways that people might attempt to explain that. You know, I always see the idea of skepticism and credulity, let's say. I always see those as part of a spectrum, right? We're more skeptical about some things, we're more critical about other things. Especially when it comes to ghost, a tremendously controversial topic, we're going to have a lot of people who will immediately say, well, this person is somehow a scam artist, right? But that doesn't hold up because it doesn't sound like she was scamming him. You know, she just wanted to convey information, which I think is a very different thing. And then there are people who will say, you know, I have witnessed behavior like this in the past. There are possibilities. There are thought experiments we could do about how this could happen, how maybe she knew this information. We know there are flim-flam artists who do that. But the problem with that flim-flam explanation, at least in this story, is that the con artists are motivated by personal profit. And there's not a profit motive here.
Well,
is there? Unless I'm missing something.
They were attempting to raise money to bring the woman back down, the one who laid the flowers for her never met father. So, you know, if you could find a way to make a GoFundMe and then skim some off the top or take the money instead of giving it to the other person, then perhaps, but there's no way to know that here. Or this whole thing could be a way to drum up support for tours of the Rock of Gibraltar. I don't know.
So Dennis is working for the Big Rock.
No, I'm not saying Dennis. This is a story told to Dennis by a tour guide.
Yeah, but why did he send it? Why'd you send it, Dennis?
Because it's
with just enough plausible deniability.
Well, because it's a really interesting story. It caught my attention. Probably did the same thing to Dennis. I'm just saying there are a wonderful number of possibilities we could explore here. But in the end, it's just a fun story.